YouTube, Jimmy with To the Top Crane. And in my last live stream, had some people asking me to explain kind of how hydraulics work. So I'm in the old crane cave here, and I apologize about the sound if the sound sucks, but doing what I can. I actually did this on the window of the crane earlier, but the audio was terrible. There was vehicles driving by and couldn't hardly see the dry erase marker on the side, and so it didn't work out too well. So anyway, I thought I'd do it down here. We're going to use a piece of paper. Stole some of my daughter's Prismacolor pencils. For those that don't know, these are fairly expensive colored pencils that artists use, and my daughter is kind of a self-made artist. So anyway, let's get into some of this. I figured I'd talk first about how a hydraulic cylinder is able to do what it does with the limited amount of pressure that's in the system. And I say limited, it varies, but so we're going to draw a basic hydraulic cylinder. So we got the barrel, and please don't critique my artistic ability or lack thereof. There's the rod, and the rod is attached to a piston inside the barrel. We'll just say this one's got an eyelet on the end for a pin to run through it. And we've got a port here and a port here. Okay, so this would be what they call a double acting cylinder. Since there's a port on both ends, this cylinder is able to go either direction based on fluid flow. Okay, now the way this works is we have system pressure, and we're going to use basic easy math for all of this. So let's say our system pressure is 2,000 psi. And we are going to put 2,000 psi into this side of the cylinder. So we'll actually do the pressure in this neat little red color, whatever it is. So we've got 2,000 psi coming into this side of the cylinder. It's going to fill the barrel up. And in doing so, it's going to shove that piston that direction. So everybody following me so far? Now on this side of the cylinder is going to be oil that's under minimal pressure. I mean, it's still going to have some pressure just because it's being shoved out of the barrel by the piston on this side. So that oil is going to come out and will return back to tank or somewhere else in the system. So it's going that way, that way, that way. So the way this all works, to generate force, and sometimes massive amounts of it, we need to find out the surface area of this piston, because we know our system pressure is 2,000 psi, so it's going to exert 2,000 pounds of force on every square inch of surface inside this cylinder. So to find the surface area of our cylinder, or our piston, we need to know its diameter. So we're just going to say this one's a 4-inch diameter piston. And now is where we got to use a little bit of math. To find the surface of a circle, the surface area of a circle, you use pi r squared, which is, if you look up the formula, it's going to be something like this times radius squared, or just pi r squared. So pi, I'll write it over here. I'm not going to go into all the digits, it's incredibly long, but it's actually 3.141 something else. We're not going to worry about this part of it today. We're just going to use easy math. So we're just going to call pi 3. So if we have a 4-inch bore, we need to know the radius. We know the radius of the radius is from the center out. So the radius on a 4-inch bore would be 2. So we got to take 2 squared. So 2 times 2, 4. So now we've got the surface, almost have the surface area of our piston. So when we take 4 times pi, so that's going to be, remember we're calling pi 3, 12. So we have roughly 12 square inches and my penmanship sucks, my apologies for that. So we have 12 square inches of surface area on this piston. So hopefully you guys are still following me. So now we can take that 2,000 psi of system pressure, so we have 2,000 times 12, and we're going to have 24,000. So on the piston side of this cylinder, if we put 2,000 psi into the piston side of a 4-inch bore, it will exert a force of 24,000 pounds, because that's 2,000 psi times the surface area, which is roughly 12. Now I'm going to flip page because it's different on the rod side, and I'll show you how it's different. So if we have our same cylinder, it doesn't matter how far down in there the piston is. Surface area is surface area and pressure is pressure. So we got our piston here, got our fitting over here, and our fitting over here. We've got pressure on this side, pressure coming in, lower pressure on this side, pressure going out. Here's where this one's different. So we know on the piston side we've got 12 square inches roughly. However, on this side, this rod takes up some of the surface area of the piston. So now we've got to determine what is the surface area of the piston without the rod in it, or with the rod in it. We already know what it is without. We figured it on the piston side. So we got to figure out the surface area of the piston with the rod in it. So we knew on the other side that our 4-inch bore is 12 square inches. Let's call this a 2-inch rod. So remember, pi r squared, so our radius is from the center out. If it's a 2-inch bore, it's 1 times 1 equals 1. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I almost wrote a 3. So is 1. And we're going to take that 1 times pi, which remember we're just calling it 3, equals 3. So I'm going to put that line in there to delineate those two. So now we know that rod has an effective surface area of 3 square inches. So we're going to take that 3 square inches and subtract it from our 12 square inches, which is going to leave us 9, and I'm getting ahead of myself again. So we got 9 square inches to work with. If we take that 2,000, the same 2,000 psi of system pressure, and we multiply that times 9, which is the surface area of the rod side of the piston, we end up with 18,000. So on the rod side, if you put 2,000 psi in here, you're going to get 18,000 pounds of force retracting this rod. So hopefully everybody was able to follow that. I know I made a few mistakes here and there because I was working ahead of myself, but hopefully everybody understands that. Hey everybody, Now we're going to go into part 2 of this, because what good is a cylinder if you don't have any pressure or flow? If you don't have any oil moving, the cylinder's useless. So there's several different kinds of pumps out there. The most common are piston pumps and gear pumps. So we'll cover gear pumps first. A gear pump, and this is going to be some pretty crude artistry here. So if we have a gear here, we got teeth all around it, which aren't symmetric at all because I'm not a very good artist. We've got another gear here. Same teeth all around it. They intermesh with one another. One gear turns the other one. And these are inside of a pump. And the inside of the housing is machined to have very tight tolerance around these gears in kind of a number 8 shape. So if this is the inlet side of our pump, this is going to be the outlet side of our pump. What actually happens is low pressure oil comes in here from the tank, and some systems have pressurized tanks, some don't. Some are gravity fed, some are force fed. Most of the time they're gravity fed, and the only pressure that's on it's atmospheric pressure. But so we've got low pressure oil coming in here. This gear or this gear, one or the other, will be driven by either an electric motor or internal combustion engine, whatever, and they're rotated. And a lot of people get this mixed up. They think that the oil gets pulled in to the center and spit out in the middle of the gears, and that's actually not the way it works. What happens is the oil comes in here, and the gears rotate the oil around the outside of the gear face. So you kind of end up with low pressure on this side of the gear. And then as the oil comes around to this side of the pump housing, it actually becomes pressurized, and the two come together as one and gets forced out of the housing as high pressure oil on this side. So hopefully everybody's following me still. So you got low pressure oil comes in, gets rotated around the gears, and like I said, these gears are machined, and this housing's machined to very tight tolerances to the gears, so very minimal oil gets lost between the gear tooth and the pump housing. As it gets forced around the inside of the pump housing, it builds pressure on the back side of the gears. Oil flows combine, and it comes out of the pump as one stream of oil. This is about the most basic style of hydraulic pump that's out there. This can also be used as a gear type hydraulic motor. The difference being, instead of it being driven at one of the gears, high pressure oil would be forced into it, and that pressurized oil would rotate the gears and turn the shaft. So that's it on our gear pumps. Now we need it to go somewhere. We need it to do something. Otherwise, this thing's just pumping oil out onto the ground, whatever. So we're going to plumb this to a valve, and we'll just call it a log splitter. So there'll be a lever sitting up here. Your oil's going to come in, pressurized. Let's see, we need a couple outlet ports. We need a return. Got our inlet. We'll have a little hydraulic cylinder down here doing its thing. Okay, now inside this valve there's a spool, and typically they're kind of shaped something like this. So it'd have an open center, based on how this is machined. And then we're going to add one more thing to this. We're going to have a pressure relief valve. Typically they're adjustable with the Allen screw, and they're just threaded into a port inside the valve body. And I'll explain what that does and how it works in just a second. So when you throw this lever one way or the other, it shifts the spool inside the valve, and it allows oil to flow two directions. So say we want to stroke the rod out this way, we throw the lever whichever direction it needs to go to have pressurized oil come in this side of the cylinder, which fills the cylinder up, shoves the rod this way. But also, if this valve didn't have a port to return oil to tank, this piston wouldn't move because the oil would be locked inside of it. So when you throw that spool, not only does it direct pressurized oil to the rod side of the cylinder, or the piston side of the cylinder, the less pressurized oil gets diverted through the valve back out to tank. So this would come out wherever our hydraulic tank is, or somewhere else in the system. It doesn't necessarily have to go back to tank, it just goes somewhere else in the system. And the same is true for the inverse. If you throw the lever the opposite direction, depending on the style of valve that it is, it will switch places. The pressurized oil would go in the rod side, the evacuated oil would come out and go back to tank. That's all handled inside the valve based on how it's machined and how the spool is designed. Now, what this relief valve does and how it works is, typically when the spool's in a neutral position, oil is just allowed to pass past the center of the spool, and it just makes a loop inside the valve and right back out the tank. So it's just constantly circulating through here. When you divert pressure by way of the spool into whatever function you're running, there's a circuit that is tapped into the pressure side of the circuit on the valve. So that circuit is ran through the relief valve. This relief valve, if you need to increase pressure, let me back up a second. It's got a spring inside of it and operates off of spring tension. So if you need to increase pressure, you can screw the screw in, which puts more tension on the spring, which makes it harder for the oil to bypass the relief valve, or harder for the oil to go through the relief valve. The inverse is also true. If you need to reduce pressure, you can back the screw out a little bit, and it takes tension off of the spring, and it makes it easier for the hydraulic pressure to force itself through the relief valve. But what happens is a little bit of this oil, this pressurized oil, is coming over here, however this is machined, and it's hanging out right here against this relief valve. And it's going to stay there until something happens that causes the pressure in this circuit to exceed what this relief valve is set at. So say this relief valve is set at 2000 psi for our system pressure. This pump's capable of producing pressure up until the point that it fails, or until it loses efficiency and starts cavitating, which is a whole nother deal altogether. But they call it deadheading the pump. Typically it'll stop the engine, or it'll sit there and cavitate oil inside of itself, which is bad. So as the oil comes up here and it's hanging out against this relief valve, if this cylinder gets to the end of its stroke, or something stops it to where it can't push more than 24,000 pounds, because we already determined on page 1 that that's what a 4-inch bore could do with 2000 psi, the pressure will exceed the 2000 pounds per square inch setting on the relief valve, and the relief valve will open and dump oil back out to tank. Hope that makes sense to everybody. Typically it's on the back side of the spool, so relief pressure doesn't go back on the outlet side of the circuit. And I've also seen some that were plumbed, the relief plumbed back to an unloading valve, which actually diverted even more oil. It all depends on how the system's set up. These systems can be very basic to extremely complex. and we'll get into a little more complex here in just a second. Okay, this is where it's going to probably get harder for people to follow, and probably harder for me to explain it, but it's worth mentioning because this is the other most common style pump and motor. It's a piston style, and if you break a piston style motor down or pump and you look at the internal portion of it, there's a rotor, which is basically a cylinder with bores in it. So those bores are machined to very specific tolerance, and these operate on very, very tight tolerances. So trash and debris and stuff in the hydraulic system will wreck one of these. So the way this is designed, there's a rotor in here. It's got bores in it, and then there's pistons that fit in each one of the bores. Now, if you just slip these pistons in and you have it rotating, nothing's going to happen. The pistons are just going to hang out, go along for the ride. How these things work is they utilize a swash plate style system. So you have to try to keep up with me on this. I drew a couple different examples here. So what happens as this rotates and you have a swash plate involved, the pistons, if the swash plate is canted this direction, it allows the piston to come out of its bore partially, almost all the way in some cases, and that cavity or that bore fills with oil. As this rotor rotates, the swash plate forces the piston deeper into the bore, and in this case, as the pistons got to the top, the pistons itself would shove oil out of the rotor and into the pump housing on the pressure side. The pressure side can also be the return side. Sometimes these can operate multi-directions. So stick with me on that. Okay, so let's go over that again. Rotor rotates, swash plate allows the pistons on the bottom to come out of their bore. That in turn fills that bore with oil because it creates a void in there. Oil's drawn into the bore. As the rotor rotates, the swash plate shoves the piston deeper into the bore until it gets to the point that the swash plate bottoms the piston out, or almost bottoms the piston out, forcing all of the oil out of that bore to the outlet side of the pump. The same holds true if it's running the opposite direction. Instead of filling at the bottom, it would just fill at the top, force its oil out at the bottom. There's different styles of piston pumps. There's fixed displacement, which means the swash plate is in a fixed position and the pistons always travel the same amount or the same distance inside the bores. Also, those don't change direction on piston type motors unless you change the flow of oil. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody there. There's also a variable displacement piston pump, which is probably the most common in your equipment, and that's also the way hydrostatic, like zero-turn mowers and whatnot, work. So what happens is this swash plate is on a pivot point, and we can adjust how far those pistons travel inside the bore. So if this was set up as a variable displacement piston pump, if we want this pump to not put out anything, then we would put the swash plate in the straight up neutral position, so it would be pretty much like this, and the pistons would stay in their relative position inside each bore. So therefore no oil would be flowing through the system. The pistons would not be pushing oil out. Now when you stroke the swash plate one direction, and it's typically variable, that's how you get hydrostatic drive. What it does is it allows the piston to come out to a certain point, fills that void with oil, or that bore with oil, and as it rotates, the swash plate forces the piston back towards the bottom of the bore and shoves the oil out. Now the way your hydrostatic drives work is if you want to go faster, or need more flow, then you shove the swash plate farther until you get to the max position, which is the piston coming as far out of the bore as possible, it filling that cavity with as much, or the bore with as much oil as possible, and then rotating around and forcing that oil back out of the bore. If you want to change directions, you make the swash plate go the opposite direction. So at that point, instead of the oil being shoved out at the top like this would show, the oil is then shoved out at the bottom, so it picks up its oil in the top side of the rotor, fills the bore, and as it rotates around, the pistons by way of the swash plate get shoved towards the bottom of the bore, which is this way, forcing its oil out of the backside of the rotor and out of the pump. So this pump is omnidirectional and it's variable. The reason why they call it a variable displacement is we can adjust how much oil this pump puts out, how much oil is displaced based on the position of the swash plate and the piston stroke. The same holds true with a piston variable displacement piston motor. If we are forcing oil into it, we can adjust how fast or slow this motor turns by adjusting the swash plate. Now, the winch motors on the Tadano use an axial piston pump, so it's along the same lines, but instead of it having a swash plate, this rotor is mounted at an angle inside. I mean, instead of a variable swash plate, it's still got a swash plate in it, but the motor is mounted something like this. And so your rotor and pistons would be up here. Now let's see, swash plate's still going to be straight up and down here, and the pistons would be out of their bore at the bottom side and shoved up into their bore on the top side because of the relationship of the pistons to the swash plate. And then it's driven by way of the shaft's kind of a balled end shaft. Here's the output shaft towards the winches, splines, and then there's a shaft that comes out of the center of the rotor with kind of a ball end with splines, so it's, oh, my artistry's terrible. So as we shove oil into this motor, it forces the pistons out against the swash plate and causes it to rotate. I hope that makes sense to everybody. It's hard to explain, and there is some videos on the old YouTube that show how those work. I'll see if I can find a few and throw some links in, maybe into the description. But that is how a variable displacement or a fixed displacement piston pump works. Pistons, rotor, bores, swash plates, all that fun stuff. Okay, now we're going to talk about accumulators. If you have accumulators in your system, you need to be very careful when servicing or messing with anything in the system. There's the two most common types of accumulators. There's one that is shaped kind of like this, and it's basically just a pressure vessel. It's got a fitting in the top for hydraulics. It's got a nitrogen fitting in the bottom, and inside there's a bladder. So when it's in its uncharged state, the bladder's in the neutral position. It's just kind of hanging out inside there. The other style is a piston style accumulator. So it's real similar to a hydraulic cylinder. There's a piston inside here, hydraulic fitting on the top, nitrogen fitting on the bottom. So both of these would be in their uncharged state. Piston on this one's in the neutral position. Bladder on this one's in the neutral position. The bladder is literally just a rubber bladder inside. So how do these work? Well, you charge each one of these accumulators with nitrogen. We're going to use actually nitrogen. Typically we use green on nitrogen, so I'll steal another. Man, these things need to be sharpened. So we got nitrogen in here on the bottom side. And at this point, these accumulators would be charged to set nitrogen pressure. What that nitrogen does is it exerts force on the piston or on the bladder, depending on which style you have. So up here would be oil. Now, on a bladder style, what happens when you get system pressure in it, and that pressure is going to be determined by whatever the engineers say you got to have, but it's adjusted by how much nitrogen fill you put in it. So we have nitrogen down here, and we're going to pretend that it's up to hydraulic operating system pressure. So the bladder gets shoved down here like so. This is full of high pressure oil, and the nitrogen gets compressed on this back side. I should have drawn all this before I started the video, but hey, we're into it now, so we're just going to roll with it. On a piston style, you got your hydraulic fitting, nitrogen fitting, piston's going to be shoved towards the bottom. All your high pressure oil is going to be on the top side, and high pressure nitrogen on the bottom side. And then if the system is discharged of hydraulic pressure, you're going to have lower pressure oil on the top side. The nitrogen's going to expand and shove the piston towards the top, or the bladder towards the top. So why is this important? Well, these accumulators are capable of storing system pressure even with the system off. So like on our crane, when we put it in the boom dolly, we have to lock out swing, and what that does is it uses accumulator pressure to hold the swing brake off. The swing brake on that is a spring applied hydraulically released swing brake. So when I put it in the dolly, I release the swing brake and I go behind the cab and I throw a couple valves, and what that does is it locks the swing circuit out and maintains the hydraulic pressure against that spring inside the swing brake to keep the swing brake released. At that point, if you were to undo this hydraulic hose on the accumulator, it would spit out system pressure, which can be very dangerous. Because a lot of times people think, well, if the machine's off, the system pressure is gone. Well, that's not necessarily the case if you have an accumulator. That might not be the case with an accumulator in it. On the cranes, these are primarily what you're going to find as a bladder style. I know if you guys watch any of Logger Wade's videos, he's got a piston style accumulator on his din, as he calls it. But that's the machine that's similar to an excavator. It's got a rotating cutter head on it. I'll show you on a quick drawing what that accumulator is used for, at least based on the video I saw, what I think that accumulator is used for. And then I'll talk briefly about why these are put in the system. So on Wade's system, let me get my viewfinder up here. He's got a piston style accumulator that hangs out inside that cutter head, and it's not an overly big one, but it's there. So it's got a piston in it, nitrogen fill on this side, hydraulics on this side, and he's got a double acting cylinder that runs the bar on the cutting portion of it. And hopefully Wade watches this video and he'll tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I'm pretty certain I've got this figured out. Okay, he's got system pressure that comes in here from the din. We're going to do that. That's too late, I guess, for red. But so he's got some system pressure comes in here. Whenever he activates that function, it shoves that rod out and forces the bar with the cutting chain on it out to cut the logs. On the back side of this, See, we got nitrogen over here. On the rod end of that system, oil is coming out of this double acting cylinder, but it's not plumbed back to tank. I think it's plumbed to this accumulator. So what happens is when you pressurize this with system pressure, it shoves the rod out, forces the oil into this accumulator, and puts the nitrogen under pressure, and it stays in that state until the oil flow is taken away from this side of the cylinder. Once the oil flow is taken away, the accumulator pressure shoves this piston back towards this side of the accumulator, puts the oil back into the cylinder, and retracts the rod. The reason why this would be very functional on a situation like that is it takes less plumbing. You don't have to run another line to this cylinder to retract it, and it's all in a nice self-contained package right there inside the cutter head. So it simplifies the hydraulic system. But that's essentially how that works. High pressure oil comes in from the system, from the din, shoves the rod out, cutter head comes down, does its thing. When he releases that pressure, the accumulator shoves oil back into the cylinder on the rod side and retracts it. And that's why when it developed a hole in it, the cutting bar wasn't coming back up, is because he lost his nitrogen charge on the back side of the accumulator, and that caused this piston to stay in one spot and oil just to hang out here. Okay, now that we've talked about what Wade has going on his cutter head, why would an accumulator be necessary in a system? Well, one example I already told you about was using the pressure in the accumulator to hold the swing brake off on the crane. One of the other things you can use an accumulator for is if, say, you're running a hydraulic jackhammer on a machine. An accumulator is typically plumbed inside the hydraulic jackhammer, and it acts as a shock absorber for the fluid. So whenever that breaker does its thing, it creates a shock load inside the hydraulic system. And what it does is it allows oil to come in and out of this accumulator at a fairly fast pace. So it takes the shock out of the hydraulic system. Hope that makes sense. It acts like a shock absorber. You got nitrogen on one side, hydraulic pressure on the other, and this piston will bounce back and forth and act like a shock absorber. The other application for an accumulator is, say your hydraulic system is designed to operate at 2,000 psi. Let's keep this in the viewfinder here. So your hydraulic system operates at 2,000 psi, and when you run, one or two functions, it's able to maintain that pressure and its system volume without an issue. But if you cause a situation where your system can't keep up with the 2,000 psi and also the flow, and I'll get into flow on a whole nother day, because flow, that really will probably go over people's heads. But if something happens where, let's say, this accumulator is set at 1,800 psi, so while the system's operating normally, it's got this accumulator stored with pressure. If for some reason you were to operate multiple functions and the system pressure would drop below that 1,800 psi threshold, then the accumulator will force its oil out into the system, giving it kind of a shot of fluid pressure and volume. So I hope everybody caught that. So it acts as, if you're familiar with electronics, it acts really similar to a capacitor. A capacitor is an electronic device that it stores electricity or energy and can release all of its energy in milliseconds into the circuit. That's essentially the way an accumulator works. If it's plumbed in there to compensate for, say, a smaller pump, or if your machine typically runs X number of functions and then there's a hydraulic circuit that doesn't get used very often, a lot of times they'll have an accumulator in there just to help compensate for when you're running auxiliary hydraulics. So what that does, like I said, at system pressure, if this accumulator is set to 1,800 psi, this accumulator is charged. the piston would be in a down position with nitrogen pressure on the backside, and all that oil would be sitting there just waiting for something to happen. As soon as the pressure dropped below, say 1800, if that's where it was set, then the nitrogen charge would overcome whatever pressure's there, and it would force extra oil into that system to compensate for too small of a pump. So, if that didn't blow everybody's minds up, we can go further, but you guys will have to let me know what you want to know. And I'm sure all that was clear as mud. But anyway, I want to throw that out there. You guys asked me for it. I may have delved a little deep, but nevertheless, we talked about it.